Hello, everyone. This is a little bit different than before because it's kind of uncomfortable to sit in a computer chair and read forever. Like, I'd rather be on something like I have this little couch here. I haven't used it for much of anything. I did have to mess with my setup again. As you can see, this is the nice camera that I'm using. And I also have, you can't see it, but I have my other microphone here because I didn't feel like moving my original microphone. But the audio quality should be pretty similar. I'm using an AT 2020 here, whereas the other one is like the AT like 975 shotgun mic. Just obviously this isn't as close to my face because of the fact that otherwise it would be in frame, and I also don't really have a boom arm spared that I can use to get it closer to me. This is gonna change things a little bit because obviously I can't press the voice modulation button that I was using before that I added in randomly to the last recording. So sorry about that, but I'll still do my best to keep up with the voices. Just Death's voice won't be like super duper deep, like, you know, the way that it's intended to be. I believe needs voice modulation, or someone with a much deeper baritone in their voice than I do. But enough about that. Let's start reading again, and I hope you guys are okay with this new format because it's a lot easier on me and my back, and I feel like I'll be able to read longer because the last video, you can probably tell there's a cut about the middle. I could only read about half an hour, and then I was like, I gotta get up and like walk around because I'm all hunched over. So this should be a lot easier, and hopefully easier reading means that I'll get more reading done, you know, which is a good thing. Anyway, sorry for the long intro. I know I say that like every time, but I just figure I should probably say that. And thank you for being here through all of this. Don't stand in the doorway, friend. Don't block up the hall. Come on in. Wendell Poons blinked in the gloom. When his eyes became accustomed to it, he realized there was a semicircle of chairs in an otherwise bare and dusty room. They were all occupied. In the center, at the focus, as it were, of the half circle, was a small table at which someone had been seated. They were now advancing toward him, with their hand out and a big smile on their face. Don't tell me, let me guess, they said. You're a zombie, right? Wendell Poons had never seen anyone with such a pallid skin, such as there was of it, before, or wearing clothes that looked as if they'd been washed in razor blades and smelled as though someone had not only died in them, but was still in them, or sporting a glad-to-be-gray badge. I don't know, he said. I suppose so. Only they buried me, you see, and there was this card. He held it out, like a shield. Course there was, said the figure. He's going to want me to shake hands, Wendell thought. If I do, I just know I'm going to end up with more fingers than I started with. Oh, my goodness. Will I end up like that? And I'm dead, he said, lamely. And fed up with being pushed around, eh? Said the greenish-skinned one. Wendell shook his hand very carefully. Well, not exactly fed. Shoe's the name. Reg Shoe. Poons. Wendell Poons, said Wendell. Yeah, it's always the same, said Red Shoe bitterly. Once you're dead, people just don't want to know, right? They act as if you got some horrible disease. Dying can happen to anyone, right? Everyone, I should have thought, said Wendell. Yeah, I know what it's like. Tell someone you're dead and they look at you as if they've seen a ghost, Mr. Shoe went on. Wendell realized that talking to Mr. Shoe was very much like talking to the Arch-Chancellor. It didn't actually matter what you said because he wasn't listening. Only in Mustrum Ridcully's case, it was because he wasn't bothering, while Red Shoe was in fact supplying your side of the conversation somewhere inside his own head. You're right, said Wendell, giving in. We were just finishing off, in fact, said Mr. Shoe. Let me introduce you. Everyone, this is, He hesitated. Poons, Wendell Poons. Brother Wendell, said Mr. Shoe. Give him a fresh start welcome. There was an embarrassed chorus of hellos. A large and rather hairy young man at the end of the row caught Wendell's eye and rolled his own yellow eyes in a theatrical gesture of fellow feeling. This is Brother Arthur Winkings, Count Not Ferrato, said a female voice sharply. And Sister Doreen, I mean Countess not Ferrato, of course. Charmed, I'm sure, said the female voice, as the small, dumpy woman sitting next to the small, dumpy shape of the Count extended a beringed hand. The Count himself gave Wendell a worried grin. He seemed to be wearing an opera dress designed for a man several sizes larger. And Brother Schleppel. The chair was empty, but a deep voice from the darkness underneath it said, "Evenin'." And Brother Lupine. The muscular, hairy young man with the long canines and pointy ears gave Wendell's hand a hearty shake. And Sister Drull, and Brother Gorper, and Brother Ixolite. Wendell shook a number of variations on the theme of hand. Brother Ixolite handed him a small piece of yellow paper. On it was written one word, "Ooey, ooey, ooey, ooey." "I'm sorry there aren't more here tonight," said Mr. Shoe. "I do my best, but I'm afraid some people just don't seem prepared to make the effort." Dead people?" said Wendell, still staring at the note. "Apathy, I call it," said Mr. Shoe bitterly. "How can the movement make progress if people are just gonna lie around the whole time?" Lupine started making frantic "don't get him started" signals behind Mr. Shoe's head, but Wendell wasn't able to stop himself in time. "What movement?" he said. "Dead rights," said Mr. Shoe promptly. "I'll give you one of my leaflets." But surely dead people don't have rights?" said Wendell. In the corner of his vision, he saw Lupine put his hand over his eyes. "You're dead right there," said Lupine, his face absolutely straight. Mr. Shoe glared at him. "Apathy," he repeated. "It's always the same. You do your best for people and they just ignore you. Do you know people can say what they like about you and take away your property just because you're dead? And I thought that most people when they died just, died," said Wendell. "It's just laziness," said Mr. Shoe. "They just don't want to make the effort." Wendell had never seen anyone look so dejected. Red Shoe seemed to shrink several inches. "How long have you been undead, Wendell?" said Doreen, with brittle brightness. "Hardly any time at all," said Wendell, relieved at the change of tone. "I must say it's turning out to be different than I imagined." "You get used to it," said Arthur Winkings, alias Count Notferotu, gloomily. "That's the thing about being undead. It's as easy as falling off a cliff. We're all undead here." Lupine coughed. "Except Lupine." "I'm more of what you might call a honorary undead," said Lupine. "Him being a werewolf," explained Arthur. "I thought he was a werewolf as soon as I saw him," said Wendell, nodding. "Every full moon," said Lupine. "Regular." "You start howling and growing hair," said Wendell. They all shook their heads. No," said Lupine. "I more sort of stop howling and some of my hair temporarily falls out. It's bloody embarrassing." "But I thought at the full moon your basic werewolf always—" "Lupine's problem," said Doreen, "is that he approaches it the other way, you see." "I'm technically a wolf," said Lupine. "Ridiculous, really. Every full moon I turn into a wolf man. The rest of the time I'm just a wolf." "Good grief," said Wendell. "That must be a terrible problem." "The trousers are the worst part," said Lupine. They are. "Oh yeah, see, it's all right for human werewolves. They just keep their clothes on. I mean, they might get a bit ripped, but at least they got them handy, right? Whereas if I see a full moon, the next minute I'm walking and talking, I'm definitely in big trouble on account of being very deficient in the trousery vicinity. So I have to keep a pair stashed somewhere. Mr. Shoe, call me Reg. Lets me keep a pair where he works." "I work at the mortuary on Elm Street," said Mr. Shoe. "I'm not afraid. It's worth it to save a brother or sister." Sorry," said Wendell. "Save?" "It's me that pins the card on the bottoms of the lids," said Mr. Shoe. "You never know. It has to be worth a try." "Does it often work?" said Wendell. He looked around the room. His tone must have suggested that it was a reasonably large room, and it only had 8 people in it, 9 if you included the voice from under the chair, which presumably belonged to a person. Doreen and Arthur exchanged glances. "It worked for Arthur," said Doreen. Excuse me, said Wendell. Couldn't help wondering, are you two, vampires by any chance? That's right, said Arthur. More's the pity. Ha! You should not talk like that, said Dorian haughtily. You should be proud of your noble lineage. Proud? Said Arthur. Did you get bitten by a bat or something? Said Wendell quickly, anxious not to be the cause of any family friction. No, said Arthur, by a lawyer. And I got this letter, see? With a posh blob of wax on it, everything, blah, 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 great-great-uncle, blah, 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 only surviving relative, blah, blah, blah. May we be the first to offer our heartiest, blah, blah, blah. 1 minute I'm Arthur Winkings, a coming man in wholesale fruit and vegetable business. Next minute I find I'm Arthur, Count, not Pt.4, owner of 50 acres of cliff face a goat would fall off of, and a castle that even the cockroaches have abandoned, and an invitation from the burgomaster to drop in down at the village one day and discuss 300 years of back taxes. I hate lawyers, said the voice down from under the chair. It had a sad, hollow sound. Wendell tried to move his legs a little closer to his own chair. It was quite a good castle, said Doreen. A bloody heap of mouldering stone is what it was, said Arthur. It had nice views. Yeah, through every wall, said Arthur, dropping a portcullis into that avenue of conversation. I should have known even before we went to look at it. So I turned the carriage around, right? I thought, well, that's 4 days wasted right in the middle of our busy season. I don't think any more about it. Next thing, I wake up in the dark. I'm in a box. I finally find these matches. I light one, and there's this card 6 inches from my nose. It said, You don't have to take this lying down, said Mr. Shue proudly. That was one of my first ones. It wasn't my fault, said Doreen stiffly. You had been lying rigid for 3 days. Gave the priest a shock, I can tell you, said Arthur. Ha! Priests, said Mr. Shue. They're all the same. Always telling you that you're gonna live again after you're dead. But you just try it and see the look on their faces. Don't like priests either, said the voice from under the chair. Wendell wondered if anyone else was hearing it. I won't forget the look on the Reverend Welligar's face in a hurry, said Arthur gloomily. I've been going to that temple for 30 years. I was respected in the community. Now if I even think of setting foot in a religious establishment, I get a pain all down my leg. Yes, but there was no need for him to say what he said when you pushed the lid off, said Doreen. And him a priest, too. They shouldn't know those kind of words. I enjoyed that temple, said Arthur wistfully. It was something to do on a Wednesday. It dawned on Wendell Poons that Doreen had miraculously acquired the ability to use her W's. And you're a vampire, too, Miss I do beg your pardon. Countess Nosferatu? He inquired politely. The Countess smiled. My word, yes, she said. By marriage, said Arthur. Can you do that? I thought you had to be bitten, said Wendell. The voice under the chair sniggered. I don't see why I would have to go around biting my wife after 30 years of marriage, and that's flat, said the Count. Every woman should share her husband's hobbies, said Doreen. It is what keeps a marriage interesting. Who wants an interesting marriage? I never said I wanted an interesting marriage. That's what's wrong with people today, expecting things like marriage to be interesting. And it's not a hobby anyway, moaned Arthur. This vampiring's not all it's cracked up to be, you know? Can't go out in daylight, can't eat garlic, can't have a decent shave. Why can't you have a... Wendell began. Can't use a mirror, said Arthur. I thought that turning into a bat bit would be interesting, but the owls around here are murder. As for the, with the blood, well... His voice trailed off. Arthur's never been very good at meeting people, said Doreen. And the worst part is having to wear evening dress the whole time, said Arthur. He gave Doreen a sideways glance. I'm sure it's not really compulsory. It is very important to maintain standards, said Doreen. Doreen, in addition to her here 1 minute and gone the next vampire accent, had decided to compliment Arthur's evening dress with what she considered appropriate for a female vampire. A figure-hugging black dress, long dark hair cut into a widow's peak, and very pallid makeup. Nature had designed her to be small and plump with frizzy hair and a hearty complexion. There were definite signs of conflict. I should have stayed in that coffin, said Arthur. No, no, said Mr. Shue. That's taking the easy way out. The movement needs people like you, Arthur. We had to set an example. Remember our motto? Which motto is that, Reg? Said Lupine warily. We have so many. Undead, yes. Unperson, no, Reg said. You see, he means well, said Lupine after the meeting had broken up. He and Wendell were walking back through the gray dawn. The Nosferatus had left early to be back home before daylight heaped even more troubles on Arthur, and Mr. Shue had gone off, he said, to address a meeting. He goes down to the cemetery behind the temple of small gods and shouts, Lupine explained. He calls it consciousness raising, but I don't reckon he's onto much of a certainty. Who was under the chair? Said Wendell. That was Schleppel, said Lupine. You think he's a boogeyman? Are boogeymen undead? He won't say. You've never seen him. I thought boogeymen hid under things or behind things and sort of leapt out at people. He's all right on the hiding. I don't think he likes the leaping out, said Lupine. Wendell thought about this. An agoraphobic boogeyman seemed to complete the full set. Fancy that, he said vaguely. We only go along to the club to keep Reg happy, said Lupine. Doreen said it'd break his heart if we stopped. You know the worst bit? Go on, said Wendell. Sometimes he brings a guitar along and makes us sing songs like The Streets of Ankh-Morpork and We Shall Overcome. It's terrible. Can't sing, eh? Said Wendell. Sing? Never mind sing. Have you ever seen a zombie try to play the guitar? It's helping him find his fingers afterward. That's so embarrassing. Lupine sighed. By the way, Sister Droll is a ghoul. If she offers you any of her meat patties, don't accept. Wendell remembered a vague, shy old lady in a shapeless gray dress. Oh, dear, he said. You mean she makes them out of human flesh? What? Oh, no. She just can't cook very well. Oh. And Brother Ixolite is probably the only banshee in the world with a speech impediment, so instead of sitting on roofs and screaming when people are about to die, he writes them a note and slips it under the door. Wendell recalled a long, sad face. He gave me one, too. We try to encourage him, said Lupine. He's very self-conscious. His arm shot out and flung Wendell against a wall. Quiet! What? Lupine's ear swiveled. His nostrils flared. Motioning Wendell to remain where he was, the wereman slunk silently along the alley until he reached its junction with another, even smaller and nastier one. He paused for a moment and then thrust a hairy hand around the corner. There was a yelp. Lupine's hand came back holding a struggling man. Huge, hairy muscles moved under Lupine's torn shirt as the man was hoisted up to fang level. You were waiting to attack us, weren't you? Said Lupine. Who, me? I could smell you, said Lupine evenly. I never. Lupine sighed. Wolves don't do this sort of thing, you know, he said. The man dangled. Hey, is that a fact? He said. It's all head-on combat, fang against fang, claw against claw, said Lupine. You don't find wolves lurking behind rocks ready to mug a passing badger. Get away? Would you like me to tear your throat out? The man stared eye to yellow eye. He estimated that his chances against a 7-foot man with teeth like that. Do I get a choice? He said. My friend here, said Lupine, indicating Wendell, is a zombie. Well, I don't know about an actual zombie. I think you have to eat some sort of fish and root to be a zombie. And do you know what zombies do to people? Don't you? The man tried to nod, even though Lupine's fist was right under his neck. Yeah, he managed. Now, he's going to take a very good look at you, and if he ever sees you again... I say, hang on, murmured Wendell. He'll come after you, won't you, Wendell? Yeah, oh yes, that's right. Like a shot, said Wendell, unhappily. Now run along, there's a good chap, okay? Okay, said the prospective mugger. He was thinking, his eyes, like giblets. Lupine let go. The man hit cobbles, gave Wendell one last terrified glance, and ran for it. What do zombies do to people? Said Wendell. I suppose I'd better know. They tear them apart like a sheet of dry paper, said Lupine. Oh, right, said Wendell. They strolled on in silence. Wendell was thinking, why me? Hundreds of people must die in the city every day. I bet they don't have this trouble. They just shut their eyes and wake up being born as someone else. Or in some sort of heaven, or I suppose, possibly some sort of hell. Or they go and feast with the gods in their hall, which has never seemed a particularly great idea. Gods are all right in their way, but not the kind of people a decent man would want to have a meal with. The Yen Buddhists think you just become very rich. Some of the Clatchian religions say you go to a lovely garden full of young women, which doesn't sound very religious to me. Wendell found himself wondering how you applied for Clatchian nationality after death. And at that moment, the cobblestones came up to meet him. This is usually a very poetic way of saying that someone fell flat on their face. In this case, the cobblestones really came up to meet him. They fountained up, circled silently in the air above the alley for a moment, then dropped like stones. Wendell stared at them. So did Lupine. That's something you don't often see, said the wereman after a while. I don't think I've ever seen stones flying before. Or dropping like stones, said Wendell. He nudged one with his toe of his boot. It seemed perfectly happy with the role gravity had chosen for it. You're a wizard. Were a wizard, said Wendell. You were a wizard. What caused all of that? I think it was probably an inexplicable phenomenon, said Wendell. There's a lot of them about, for some reason. I wish I knew why. He prodded a stone again. It showed no inclination to move. I'd better be getting along, said Lupine. What's it like, being a wereman? Said Wendell. Lupine shrugged. Lonely, he said. You don't fit in, you see. When I'm a wolf, I remember what it's like to be a man and vice versa. Sometimes, right? When I'm wolf-shaped, I run up to the hills in the winter, where there's a crescent moon in the sky and a crust on the snow, and the hills go on forever. And the other wolves, well, they feel what it's like, of course, but they don't know like I do. To feel and know at the same time. No one else knows what that's like. No one else in the whole world could know what that's like. Well, that's the bad part, knowing that there's no one else. Wendell became aware of teetering on the edge of a pit of sorrows. You never knew what to say in moments like this. Lupin brightened up. Come to that. What's it like, being a zombie? It's okay. It's not too bad. Lupin nodded. See you around, then, he said, and strode off. The streets were beginning to fill up as the population of Ankh-Morpork began its informal shift change between the night people and the day people. All of them avoided Wendell. People didn't bump into a zombie if they could help it. He reached the university gates, which were now open, and made his way to his bedroom. He'd need money if he was moving out. He'd saved quite a lot over the years. Had he made a will? He had been fairly confused over the past 10 years or so. He might have made one. Had he been confused enough to leave all his money to himself? He hoped so. There had been practically no known cases of anyone successfully challenging their own will. He levered up the floorboard by the end of the bed and lifted out a bag of coins. He remembered he had been saving up for his old age. There was his diary. It was a 5-year diary, he recalled, so in a technical sense, Wendell had wasted about, he did a quick calculation, yes, about 3/5 of his money. Or more when you came to think about it. After all, there wasn't much on the pages. Wendell hadn't done anything worth writing down for years, or at least anything he'd been able to remember by the evening. There were just phases of the moon, lists of religious festivals, and the occasional sweet stuck to a page. There was something else down there under the floor, too. He fumbled around in the dusty space and found a couple of smooth spheres. He pulled them out and stared at them, mystified. He shook them and watched the tiny snowfalls. He read the writing, noting how it wasn't so much as the writing as drawing of writing. He reached down and picked up the third object. It was a little bent metal wheel. Just one little metal wheel. And beside it, a broken sphere. Wendell stared at them. Of course, he had been a bit non-compos mentis in his last 30 years or so, and maybe he'd worn his underwear outside his clothes and dribbled a bit, but He'd collected souvenirs? And little wheels? There was a cough behind him. Wendell dropped the mysterious object back into the hole and looked around. The room was empty, but there seemed to be a shadow behind the open door. Hello? He said. A deep rumbling, but very diffident voice said, "It's only me, Mr. Poons." Wendell wrinkled his forehead with the effort of recollection. Schleppel? He said. That's right. The boogeyman? That's right. Behind my door? That's right. Why? It's a friendly door. Wendell walked over to the door and gingerly shut it. There was nothing behind it but old plaster, although he did fancy that he felt air movement. "I'm under the bed now, Mr. Poons," said Schleppel's voice from... "Yes, under the bed. You don't mind, do you?" "Well, no, I suppose not. But shouldn't you be in a closet somewhere? That's where boogeymen used to hide when I was a lad." "A good closet is hard to find, Mr. Poons." Wendell sighed. "All right, the underside of the bed's yours. Make yourself at home or whatever." "I'd prefer to go back to lurking behind the door, Mr. Poons, if it's all the same to you." "No, all right. Do you mind shutting your eyes for a moment?" Wendell obediently shut his eyes. There was another movement of air. "You can look now, Mr. Poons." Wendell opened his eyes. "Gosh," said Schleppel's voice, "you even got a coat hook and everything behind here." Wendell watched the brass knobs at the end of his bedside unscrew themselves. A tremor shook the floor. "What is going on, Schleppel?" he said. "Build-up of life force, Mr. Poons." "Oh, you mean you know?" "Oh, yes. Hey, wow, there's a lock and handle and brass fingerprint and plate and everything behind here. What do you mean, a build-up of life force? And the hinges, and there's really good rising butts here. Never had a door with Schleppel." "Just life force, Mr. Poons. You know, it's kind of force that you get in things that are alive. Thought you wizards knew about this sort of thing." Wendell Poons opened his mouth to say something like, "Of course we do," before proceeding diplomatically to find out what the hell the boogeyman was talking about, and then remembered that he didn't have to act like that now. That's what he would have done if he was alive, but despite what Red Shoe proclaimed, it's quite hard to be proud when you were dead. A bit stiff, perhaps, but not proud. "Never heard of it," he said. "What's it building up for?" "Dunno. Very unseasonal. It ought to be dying down around now," said Schleppel. The floor shook again. Then the loose floorboard that had concealed Wendell's little fortune creaked and started to put out shoots. "What do you mean, unseasonal?" he said. "You get a lot of it in the spring," said the voice behind the door, "shoving the daffodils up at the ground and that kind of stuff." "Never heard of it," said Wendell, fascinated. "I thought you wizards knew everything about everything." Wendell looked at his wizarding hat. Burial and tunneling had not been kind to it, but after more than a century of wear, it hadn't been the height of haute couture to start with. I probably said that wrong. Don't worry about it. "There's always something new to learn," he said. It was another dawn. Cyril the cockerel stirred on his perch. The chalked words glowed in the half-light. He concentrated. He took a deep breath. "Dock-a-loodle fod!" Now that the memory problem was solved, there was only the dyslexia to worry about. Up on the high fields, the wind was strong and the sun was close and strong. Bill Dorr strode back and forth across the stricken grass of the hillside, like a shuttle across a green weave. He wondered if he'd ever felt wind and sunlight before. Yes, he'd felt them. He must have done, but he'd never experienced them like this. The way the wind pushed at you, the way the sun made you hot, the way you could feel time passing, carrying you with it. There was a timid knocking on the barn door. "Yes?" "Come on down here, Bill Dorr." He climbed down in the darkness and opened the door cautiously. Miss Flitworth was shielding a candle with one hand. She said. "I'm sorry." "You can come in the house if you like, for the evening. Not for the night, of course. I mean, I don't like to think of you all alone out here of an evening when I've got a fire and everything." Bill Dorr was no good at reading faces. It was a skill he never needed. He stared at Miss Flitworth's frozen, worried, pleading smile, like a baboon looking for meaning in the Rosetta Stone. "Thank you," he said. She scuttled off. When he arrived at the house, she wasn't in the kitchen. He followed a rustling, scraping noise out into a narrow hallway and through a low doorway. Miss Flitworth was down on her hands and knees in the little room beyond, feverishly lighting the fire. She looked up, flustered, when he rapped politely on the open door. "Hardly worth putting a match to it for one," she mumbled, by way of embarrassed explanation. "Sit down. I'll make us some tea." Bildor folded himself into one of the narrow chairs by the fire and looked around the room. It was an unusual room. Whatever its functions were, being lived in apparently wasn't one of them. Whereas the kitchen was a sort of roofed-over outside space and the hub of the farm's activities, this room resembled nothing so much as a mausoleum. Contrary to general belief, Bildor wasn't very familiar with funeral decor. Deaths didn't normally take place in tombs, except in rare and unfortunate cases. The open air, the bottoms of rivers, halfway down sharks, any amount of bedrooms, yes. Tombs? No. His business was the separation of the wheat germ of the soul from the chaff of the mortal body, and that was usually concluded long before any of the rites associated with, when you got right down to it, a reverential form of garbage disposal. But this room looked like the tombs of those kings who wanted to take it all with them. Bildor sat with his hands on his knees, looking around. First, there were the ornaments, more teapots than one might think possible, china dogs with staring eyes, strange cake stands, miscellaneous statues and painted plates with cheery little messages on them. A present from Quirm, long life and happiness. They covered every flat surface in a state of total democracy, so that a rather valuable antique silver candlestick was next to a bright-colored china dog with a bone in its mouth and an expression of culpable idiocy. Pictures hid the walls. Most of them were painted in shades of mud and showed depressed cattle standing on wet moorlands in a fog. In fact, the ornaments almost concealed the furniture, but this was no loss. Apart from 2 chairs groaning under the weight of accumulated antimacassars, the rest of the furniture seemed to have no use whatsoever apart from supporting ornaments. There were spindly tables everywhere. The floor was layered in rag rugs. Someone had really liked making rag rugs. And above all, and around all, and permeating all, was the smell. It smelled of long, dull afternoons. On a cloth-draped sideboard were 2 small wooden chests flanking a larger one. They must be the famous boxes full of treasure, he thought. He became aware of ticking. There's a clock on the wall. Someone had once had what they must have thought was the jolly idea of making a clock like an owl. When the pendulum swung, the clock's eyes went backward and forward in what the seriously starved of entertainment probably imagined was a humorous way. After a while, your own eyes started to oscillate in sympathy. Miss Flitworth bustled in with a loaded tray, and there was a blur of activity as she performed the alchemical ceremony of making tea, buttering scones, arranging biscuits, hooking sugar tongs on the basin. She sat back. Then, as if she had been in a state of repose for 20 minutes, she trilled slightly, breathlessly. "Well, isn't this nice?" "Yes, Miss Flitworth." "Don't have the occasion to open up the parlor these days?" "No." "Not since I lost my dad." For a moment, Bildor wondered if she lost the late Mr. Flitworth in the parlor. Perhaps he'd taken a wrong turning among the ornaments. Then he recalled the funny little ways humans put things. "Ah. He used to sit in that very chair, reading the almanac." Bildor searched his memory. "A tall man," he ventured, "with a mustache, missing the tip of the little finger on his left hand." Miss Flitworth stared at him over the top of her cup. You knew him," she said. "I think I met him once." "He never mentioned you," said Miss Flitworth archly. "Not by the name, not as Bildor." "I don't think he would have mentioned me," said Bildor slowly. "It's all right," said Miss Flitworth. "I know all about it. Dad used to do a bit of smuggling, too. Well, this isn't a big farm. It's not what you'd call a living. He'd always said a body has to do what it can. I expect you were in his line of business. I'd been watching you. That was your business, right enough. Bildor thought deeply. General transportation, he said. That sounds like it, yes. Have you got any family, Bill? A daughter. That's nice. I'm afraid we've lost touch. That's a shame, said Miss Flitworth, and sounded as though she meant it. We used to have some good times here in the old days. That was when my young man was alive, of course. You have a son? Said Bill, who was losing track. She gave him a sharp look. I invite you to think hard about the word miss, she said. We takes things like that seriously in these parts. My apologies. No, Rufus was his name. He was a smuggler like Dad. Not as good, though, I've got to admit that. He was more artistic. He used to give me all sorts of things from foreign parts, you know. Bits of jewelry and such like. And we used to go dancing. He had very good calves, I remember. I like to see good legs on a man. She stared at the fire for a while. See, he never come back one day. Just before we were going to be wed, Dad said he never should have tried to run the mountains that close to winter, but I know he wanted to do it so as he could bring me a proper present. And he wanted to make some money and impress Dad, because Dad was against... She picked up the poker and gave the fire a more ferocious jab than it deserved. Anyway, some folks said he ran away to Farfarie or Ankh-Morpork or somewhere, but I know he wouldn't have done something like that. The penetrating look she gave Bildor nailed him to the chair. What do you think, Bildor? She said sharply. He felt quite proud of himself for spotting the question within the question. Miss Flitworth, the mountains can be very treacherous in the winter. She looked relieved. That's what I've always said, she said. You know what, Bildor? Do you know what I thought? No, Miss Flitworth. It was the day before we were going to be wed, like I said. And then one of his pack ponies came back by itself, and the men went and found the avalanche. And you know what I thought? I thought, that's ridiculous. That's stupid. Terrible, isn't it? Oh, I thought other things afterward, naturally. But the first thing was that the world shouldn't act as if it's some kind of book. Isn't that a terrible thing to have thought? I myself have never trusted drama, Miss Flitworth. She wasn't really listening. And I thought, what life expects me to do now is moon around the place in the wedding dress for years and go completely doolally. So that's what it wants me to do. Ha! Oh, yes. So I put the dress in the rag bag, and we still invited everyone to the wedding breakfast, because it's a crime to let good food go to waste. She attacked the fire again and gave him another megawatt stare. I think it's really very important to see what's really real and what isn't, don't you? Miss Flitworth? Yes? Do you mind if I stop the clock? She glanced up at the boggle-eyed owl. What? Oh, why? I am afraid it gets on my nerves. It's not very loud, is it? Bildor wanted to say that every tick was like the hammering of iron clubs on bronze pillars. It's just rather annoying, Miss Flitworth. Well, stop it if you want to, I'm sure. I only keep it wound up for the company. Bildor got up, thankfully, stepped gingerly through the forest of ornaments, and grabbed the pine-cone-shaped pendulum. The wooden owl glared at him, and the ticking stopped, at least in the realm of common sound. He was aware that elsewhere the pounding of time continued nonetheless. How could people endure it? They allowed time in their houses, as though it was a friend. He sat down again. Miss Flitworth had started to knit, ferociously. The fire rustled in the grate. Bildor leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. Your horse enjoying himself? Pardon? Your horse. He seems to be enjoying himself in the meadow, prompted Miss Flitworth. Oh, yes. Running around as if he's never seen grass before. He likes grass. And you like animals, I can tell. Bildor nodded. His reserves of small talk, never very liquid, had dried up. He sat silently for the next couple of hours, hands gripping arms of the chair, until Miss Flitworth announced that she was going to bed. Then he went back to the barn and slept. Bill Dorr hadn't been aware of its coming, but there it was, a gray figure floating in the darkness of the barn. Somehow it had got hold of the timer inside. It told him, Bill Dorr, there had been a mistake. The glass shattered. Fine golden seconds glittered in the air for a moment, then settled. It told him, return, you have work to do. There has been a mistake. The figure faded. Bill Dorr nodded. Of course there had been a mistake. Anyone could see there had been a mistake. He'd known all along it had been a mistake. He tossed the overalls in a corner and took up the robe of absolute blackness. Well, it had been an experience, and he had to admit, one that he didn't want to relive. He felt as though a huge weight had been removed. Was that what it was really like to be alive? The feeling of darkness dragging you forward? How could they live with it? And yet they did. It even seemed to find enjoyment in it, when surely the only sensible course would be to despair. Amazing. To feel you were a tiny living thing, sandwiched between two cliffs of darkness. How could they stand to be alive? Obviously, it was something he had to be born to. Death saddled his horse and rode out and up over the fields. The corn rippled far below, like the sea. Miss Flitworth would have to find someone else to help her in the harvest. That was odd. There was a feeling there. Regret? Was that it? But it was Bill Dorr's feeling, and Bill Dorr was dead, had never lived. He was his old self again, safe, where he had no feelings and no regrets. Never any regrets. And now he was in his study, and that was odd, because he couldn't quite remember how he'd got there. 1 minute on horseback, the next in the study, with its ledgers and timers and instruments. And it was bigger than he remembered. The walls lurked on the edges of sight. That was Bill Dorr's doing. Of course it would seem big to Bill Dorr. There would probably just be a bit of him still hanging on. The thing to do was keep busy, throw himself into his work. There were already some life timers on the desk. He didn't remember putting them there, but that didn't matter. The important thing was to get on with the job. He picked up the nearest one and read the name. Lord of Foodle Walk! Miss Flitworth sat up in bed. On the edge of dreams, she had heard another noise, which must have woken the cockerel. She fiddled with the match until she got a candle alight, and felt under the bed, and her fingers found the hilt of a cutlass that had been much employed by the late Mr. Flitworth during his business trip across the mountains. She hurried down the creaking stairs and out into the chill of dawn. She hesitated at the barn door, and then pulled it open just enough to slip inside. Mr. Dorr? There was a rustle in the hay, and then an alert silence. Miss Flitworth? Did you call out? I'm sure I heard someone shout my name. There was another rustle, and Bill Dorr's head appeared over the edge of the loft. Miss Flitworth? Yes, who did you expect? Are you all right? Yes. Yes, I believe so. You sure you're all right? You woke up Cyril. Yes, it was just, I thought that... Yes. She blew out the candle. There was already enough pre-dawn light to see by. Well, if you're sure, now I'm up, I may as well put the porridge on. Bill Dorr lay back on the hay until he felt he could trust his legs to carry him, then climbed down and tottered across the yard to the farmhouse. He said nothing while she ladled porridge into a bowl in front of him and drowned it with cream. Finally, he couldn't contain himself any longer. He didn't know how to ask the questions, but he really needed answers. Miss Flitworth? Yes? What is it in the night when you see things, but they are not the real things? She stood, porridge pot in one hand and ladle in the other. Do you mean dreaming? She said. Is that what dreaming is? Don't you dream? I thought everyone dreamed. About things that are going to happen? That's premonitions, that is. I've never believed in them myself. You're not telling me you don't know what dreams are? No, of course not. What's worrying you, Bill? I suddenly know that we are going to die. She watched him thoughtfully. Well, so does everyone, she said. That's what you've been dreaming about, is it? Everyone feels like this sometimes. I wouldn't worry about it if I were you. Best thing to do is keep busy and act cheerful, I always say. but we will come to an end. No, I don't know about that, said Miss Flitworth. It all depends on what kind of life you've led, I suppose. I'm sorry? Are you a religious man? You mean that what happens to you when you die is what you believe will happen? It would be nice if that was the case, wouldn't it? She said brightly. But, you see, I know what I believe. I believe nothing. We are gloomy this morning, aren't we? Said Miss Flitworth. Best thing you could do right now is finish off that porridge. It's good for you. They say it builds healthy bones. Bildor looked down at the bowl. Can I have some more? Bildor spent the morning chopping wood. It was pleasantly monotonous. Getting tired, that was important. He must have slept before last night, but he must have been so tired that he didn't dream, and he was determined not to dream again. The axe rose and fell on logs like clockwork. No, not like clockwork. Miss Flitworth had several pots on the stove when he came in. It smells good, Bill volunteered. He reached for a wobbling pot lid. Miss Flitworth spun around. Don't touch it! You don't want that stuff. It's for the rats. Do rats not feed themselves? You bet they do. That's why we're going to give them a little extra something before the harvest. A few dollops around the holes, and no more rats. It took a little while for Bildor to put two and two together, but when this took place, it was like megaliths mating. This is poison? Essence of spickle mixed with oatmeal. Never fails. And they die? Instantly, straight over, legs in the air. We're having bread and cheese, she added. I ain't doing big cooking twice in one day, so we're having chicken tonight. Talking of chicken, in fact. Come on. She took a cleaver off the rack and went out into the yard. Cyril the cockerel eyed her suspiciously from the top of the midden. His harem of fat and rather elderly hens, who had been scratching up the dust, bounded unsteadily towards Miss Flitworth in the broken knicker elastic runs of hens everywhere. She reached down quickly and picked one up. It regarded Bildor with bright, stupid eyes. Do you know how to pluck a chicken? Said Miss Flitworth. Bill looked from her to the hen. But we feed them, he said helplessly. That's right, and then they feed us. This one's been off the lay for months. That's how it goes in the chicken world. Mr. Flitworth used to wring their necks, but I never got the knack of that. The cleaver's messy and they run around a bit afterward, but they're dead all right, and they know it. Bildor considered his options. The chicken had focused one beady eye on him. Chickens are a lot more stupid than humans and don't have the sophisticated mental filters that prevent them from seeing what is truly there. It knew where it was and who was looking at it. He looked into its small and simple life and saw the last few seconds pouring away. He'd never killed. He'd taken life, but only when it was finished with. There was a difference between theft and stealing by finding. Not the cleaver, he said warily. Give me the chicken. He turned his back for a moment, then handed the limp body back to Miss Flitworth. Well done, she said, and went back to the kitchen. Bildor felt Cyril's accusing gaze on him. He opened his hand. A tiny spot of light hovered over his palm. He blew on it gently, and it faded away. After lunch, they put down the rat poison. He felt like a murderer. A lot of rats died. Down in the runs under the barn, in the deepest one tunneled long ago by long-forgotten ancestral rodents, something appeared in the darkness. It seemed to have difficulty deciding what shape it was going to be. It began as a lump of highly suspicious cheese. That didn't seem to work. Then it tried something that looked very much like a small, hungry terrier. This was also rejected. For a moment, it was a steel-jawed trap. This was clearly unsuitable. It cast around for fresh ideas, and much to its surprise, one arrived smoothly, as if traveling from no distance at all. Not so much a shape as a memory of a shape. It tried and found that, while totally wrong for the job, in some deeply satisfying way, it was the only shape it could possibly be. It went to work. That evening, the men were practicing archery on the green. Bildor had carefully ensured a local reputation as the worst bowman in the entire history of Toxophily. It had never occurred to anyone that putting arrows through the hats of bystanders behind him must logically take a lot more skill than merely sending them through quite a large target, a mere 50 yards away. It was amazing how many friends you could make by being bad at things, provided you were bad enough to be funny. So he was allowed to sit on the bench outside the inn with the old men. Next door, sparks poured from the chimney of the village smithy and spiraled up into the dusk. There was a ferocious hammering from behind its closed doors. Bildor wondered why the smithy was always shut. Most smiths worked with their doors open, so that their forge became the unofficial village meeting room. This one was keen on his work. "Hello, Skellington." He swiveled around. The small child of the house was watching him with the most penetrating gaze he had ever seen. "You are a Skellington, aren't you?" she said. "I can tell 'cause of the bones." "You are mistaken, small child." "You are. People turn into Skellingtons when they're dead. They're not supposed to walk around afterward." "Ha ha ha. Will you hark at the child?" "Why are you walking around, then?" Bildor looked at the old men. They appeared engrossed in the sport. "I'll tell you what," he said desperately. "If you will go away, I will give you a halfpenny." "I've got a Skellington mask for when we go trick-or-treating on Soul Cake night," she said. "It's made of paper. You get given sweets." Bildor made the mistake millions of people had tried before with small children, in a slightly similar circumstances. He resorted to reason. "Look," he said, "if I was really a skeleton, little girl, I'm sure these old gentlemen here would have something to say about it." She regarded the old men at the other end of the bench. They're nearly Skellingtons anyway," she said. "I shouldn't think they'd want to see another one." He gave in. "I have to admit that you are right on that point." "Why don't you fall to bits?" "I don't know. I never have." "I've seen Skellingtons of birds and things, and they all fall to bits." "Perhaps it is because they are what something was, whereas this is what I am." The apothecary who does medicine over in the Chambley's got a Skellington on a hook with all wire to hold the bones together," said the child, with an air of one imparting information gained after diligent research. "I don't have wires." "There's a difference between alive Skellingtons and dead ones." "Yes." "It's a dead Skellington when he's got, then, is it?" "Yes." "What was inside someone?" "Yes." "Ugh. Yuck." The child stared distantly at the landscape for a while and then said, "I've got new socks." "Yes?" "You can look if you like." A grubby foot was extended for inspection. "Well, well, fancy that. New socks." "My mom knitted them out of sheep." "My word." The horizon was given another inspection. "Do you know," she said, "do you know it's Friday?" "Yes." "I found a spoon." Bildor found he was waiting expectantly. He was not familiar with people who had the attention span of less than 3 seconds. "You work along Miss Flitworth's?" "Yes." "My dad says you got your feet properly under the table there." Bildor couldn't think of an answer to this because he didn't know what it meant. It was one of those many flat statements humans made that were really just a disguise for something more subtle, which was often conveyed merely by the tone of voice or a look in the eyes, neither of which was being done by the child. "My dad says she's got a box of treasure." "Has she?" "I've got tuppence." "My goodness." "Sal!" They both looked up as Miss Lifton appeared on the doorstep. "Bedtime for you. Stop worrying Mr. Door." "Oh, I assure you she is not." "Say goodnight now." "How do Skellingtons go to sleep? They can't close their eyes because—" He heard their muffled voices just inside the inn. "You mustn't call Mr. Door that just because he's very thin." "It's all right. He's not the dead sort." Miss Lifton's voice had the familiar worried tones of someone who can't bring themselves to believe the evidence of their own eyes. "Perhaps he's just been very ill." "I should think he's just about been as ill as he can be ever." Bildor walked back home thoughtfully. There was a light from the farmhouse kitchen, but he went straight to the barn, climbed the ladder of the hayloft, and lay down. He could put off dreaming, but he couldn't escape remembering. He stared at the darkness. After a while, he was aware of the pattering of feet. He turned. A stream of pale rat-shaped ghosts skipped along the roof beam above his head, fading as they ran, so that soon there was nothing but the sound of scampering. They were followed by a shape. It was about 6 inches high. It wore a black robe. It held a small scythe in one skeletal paw. A bone-white nose from brittle gray whiskers protruded from a shadowy hood. Bildor reached out and picked it up. It didn't resist, but stood on the palm of his hand and eyed him as one professional to another. Bildor said, "And you are?" The Death of Rats nodded. "Squeak." "I remember," said Bildor, "when you were a part of me." The Death of Rats squeaked again. Bildor fumbled in the pocket of his overall. He'd put some of his lunch in there. "Ah, yes. I expect," he said, "that you could murder a piece of cheese." The Death of Rats took it graciously. Bildor remembered visiting an old man once, only once, who had spent almost his entire life locked in a cell in a tower for some alleged crime or other, and had tamed little birds for company during his life sentence. They crapped on his bedding and ate his food, but he tolerated them and smiled at their flight in and out of high-barred windows. Death had wondered, at the time, why anyone would do something like that. "I won't delay you," he said. "I expect you've got things to do, rats to see. I know how it is." And now he understood. He put the figure back on the beam and lay down in the hay. "Drop in any time you're passing." Bildor stared at the darkness again. Sleep. He could feel her prowling around. Sleep. With a pocket full of dreams. He lay in the darkness and fought back. And I think that's where we'll finish up this video for today. I'm going to check the audio and everything and make sure it's all good. But I think going forward, this is going to be the format for reading. Because it's way more comfortable for me to just kind of like relax on... Like, my computer chair is not super uncomfortable, but it's definitely not fun to like read a book. Whereas I can lay back and it feels a lot more natural to do this. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Like I said, I'm sorry that I added voice modulation into the last video and now it's gone because the box is over there and I can't press the button from here. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope that you're enjoying Reaper Man so far. We are about halfway through, give or take. So yeah, we'll keep at this. Let me go stop the recording. But yeah, thank you once again. You guys are fantastic. Until next time.